afternoon. About 74 years ago, on December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan forced us into a war we didn't want to even get into. Y'all remember Pearl Harbor? All we wanted to do was to send resources to Europe and help end the Nazi Germany occupation back then. Now, a few years later, 1945, August 6th, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The area of total evaporation from the atomic bomb blast measured 1/2 mile in diameter. Total destruction, 1 mile in diameter. Severe blast damage as much as 2 miles in diameter. Within a diameter of 2.5 miles, everything that was able to burn, burned. The remaining area of the blast zone was riddled with serious blazes that stretched out to the final edge at a little over 3 miles in diameter. Robert Lewis was the co-pilot on that B-29 bomber that dropped the first bomb. He's quoted as saying, "My God, what have we done?" 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki fell to that same treatment, but the pilots missed their target by over 1.5 miles, and yet it still leveled nearly half the city. In a split second, Nagasaki's population dropped from 422,000 to 383,000. The next day, Japan offered to surrender on August 10th, 1945. Now, the bombs utilized only 1/10 of 1% of their respective explosive capabilities. And now, at that time, America occupied Japan as well as most of Europe. Out of the ashes of a destroyed Europe and Japan came the rebuilding process. And in that rebuilding of a physical Western Europe came the Iron Curtain. Germany was divided in half due to the communist Russia's gain of territory during that war, who were actually our allies. Western Europe simmered down to what became known as the Cold War. The capabilities and war of the two world superpowers, Russia and America, were evident. The think tank of Western Europe began in an unsettled state of mind and with no faith whatsoever of what the future would hold. And that was when the idea of a united Europe was born, right after that war. Many, many times we have proved through the scriptures, these sermons and Bible studies, that the 4 Gentile world-ruling kingdoms of history would accumulate or combine themselves into the 4th and final world-ruling government. We know through history that Babylon was the first world-ruling kingdom, followed by Persia, Greece, and finally Rome. I talked about that last Saturday. As each kingdom conquered the existing world-ruling kingdom, the characteristics and governmental attributes remained in their ways of thought and their way of nature. Turn to Revelation chapter 14. From Babylon, we have a common link to today's governmental systems and institutions, including the library and educational systems, the decimal systems of 10, the degrees on the positioning of the globe, and many more science and engineering techniques that would later become separated from the politics and separated from the religions. With Babylon as the catalyst, we see also in Jeremiah that God caused all the nations of the world to symbolically drink from the symbolic wine cup of his fury. You can note Jeremiah 25 and read that later. In Revelation chapter 14, starting verse 8, "And there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." He says that twice. A few pages later, you can turn to Revelation 16, verse 15. Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked, and they see his shame. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. Verse 17, and the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, It is done. And there were voices and thunders, lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake, and so great. Verse 19, and the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon came in remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Later in Revelation 18, speaking of the same, a few pages later, and after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lighted with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen. He says it again, is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. This head of gold that we talked about last week in the image of Daniel 2 still exists, as does the rest of this image of the body that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. We also talked about the stump of the roots, and it still is evident in this world. The physical kingdom of Babylon is no longer here, but spiritual Babylon is alive and well. Babylon fell once so far and is about to fall again spiritually. King Nebuchadnezzar's grandson inherited the kingdom of Babylon somewhere after, as you read, after the end of chapter 4 in the book of Daniel. We were revealed by God in the writings of Daniel that Belshazzar, which was his name, he knew what had happened to his grandfather, but he didn't heed the lesson. In Daniel 5, while Belshazzar, that new king of Babylon, was partying and drinking, he went a little bit too far. His pride and ego was nothing compared to his arrogance at that time. He was actually getting drunk using the cups and vessels that were stolen from God's temple at Jerusalem. With this provocation, he saw what appeared a man's hand come out of nowhere and write with his finger on the wall some kind of riddle that he didn't understand. Daniel, of course, was the only one that could interpret it as you read through that story. In Daniel 5, verse 25, this says, and this is the writing that was written, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing, Daniel says. Mene, God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Once again, God uses a word twice, and that word is Mene, which God has numbered the kingdom and finished it. God's timeline that we're on cannot be stopped. God's kingdom will be established. It doesn't matter what you believe, it's going to happen anyway. That same night, Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, was killed. The time now was for the kingdom of Persia. It was also time for the end of Jerusalem's 70-year rest and the rebuilding of its temple. Now, it's funny how the world rule of Babylon of 70 years was exactly parallel to the 70 years prophecy of Jerusalem's rest. Isn't it also funny, if we think about things today, how many end-time world events over the past few decades run parallel with the course of our heritage, the worldwide Church of God and its establishment. God's end-time church, our heritage from the past. Things like the European Union coming out of the ashes of World War II. Israel being declared a state in 1947 or 1948. I don't know if anybody remembers Ambassador College, but it was during the decade of the 50s it was reaching its peak. And you can make a list of things that go parallel with these end-time decades. In Daniel 7, in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, God uses the metaphor and the analogy of animals to describe those same world-ruling empires that we read of in the image of Daniel chapter 2. This time, Daniel himself has a dream and he writes it down. I won't read the whole chapter, but later in verse 17, he's given the interpretation of the vision that he had described earlier in the chapter. These great beasts, which are four kings which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. He says, then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. In verse 20, and the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn among the 10 that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great, very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And he goes on. How long would this fourth kingdom last? With the 10 horns plus one at its end. Verse 21 says, I beheld, and that same horn made war with the saints, interesting, and prevailed against them. How long? Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall be different, diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and tread it down, break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. There's a clue there. Read a little further. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a times, and a dividing of time. 3.5 years. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. And all dominions shall serve and obey him. Hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. The abomination of desolation spoken of by Jesus Christ in Matthew 24 cannot happen until a uniting of Europe occurs. And inside this united Europe, 10 kings, quote unquote, will make their stand. Keep in mind verse 24, and the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them. As far as our heritage is concerned, and as it goes, for decades, a lot of us have heard the late Mr. Garner Ted Armstrong and his father before him, the late Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, state over and over again that a 10-nation combined European power would emerge under the leadership of France and Germany. And they refer back to 3 verses in Revelation chapter 17. I'll read those 3. Verse 12, 13, and 14 of Revelation 17 says, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For the time setting here, for he is Lord of lords, King of kings, and they that are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. I don't know if anybody remembers the Plain Truth magazine. That was a pretty good magazine. And all the literature that came through Ambassador College and the Worldwide Church of God, which many of us have probably loads and shelves full of them. The Plain Truth, June 1952, if I can quote this, page 11. Quote, the 10 horns in the 17th chapter of Revelation will be the revival of the beast, the Roman Empire, out of the bottomless pit by a United States of Europe, or federation of 10 European nations within the bounds of the old Roman Empire. And he says that includes Eastern Europe. This is June 1952. One more, January of 1963 of the same magazine, page 5 says, daring new plans for monetary reform and economic planning are on the drawing boards. These will so inexorably mesh the economies of those 6 nations in Eastern Europe, Western Europe at the time, reports Time magazine, that they will, quote, clear the way for the final goal of a politically unified Europe. Later in that same article, he says, so Germany, not atheistic communist Russia, is ultimately going to support an Arab union against the Jews and against Israel, Britain and America. This is what prophecy foretells, unquote. Now, this was long before the collapse of Russia or even Germany that was reunited back in '89. Matter of fact, Governor Ted Armstrong wrote a book soon after that in 1990. And one of the subtitles is, who are the final 10? And I'll quote, the 10 nations or kings are not together yet. At this writing, it says in 1990, it is difficult to say which nations will comprise the 10 kings of Bible prophecy. It may be many, many years long process. It will take time. And it has taken time. The process of European integration was launched on May 9th, 1950, when France officially proposed to create, quote, the first concrete foundation of a European federation, unquote. 6 countries, interesting number, joined from the very beginning. That was Belgium, Germany, France, of course, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Later in 1973, Denmark, Ireland, and the UK joined. The total number of kingdoms, quote unquote, became 9. 1981, Greece became the 10th nation to join the EU. Now, a lot of followers of the Plain Truth and the teachings back then, when they saw Greece become that 10th kingdom or nation in Western Europe, it seemed to a lot of them, the prophecies being fulfilled. And I can see where they would get that inclination. A lot of them did mistakenly start putting dates on early 70s, 73, 75, before 81. But in 1986, Spain and Portugal joined the Union. 1995, later, Austria, Finland, and Sweden. And then back in 2004, after 4 waves of accessions, the EU and 15 member states prepared for the accession of 13 Eastern and Southern European countries to form with them. Now, with the help of the collapsed Soviet Union and Russia, 10 of these were implemented, bringing it a total to 25 member states. On January 1st, 2007, Bulgaria and Romania were welcomed to the EU, bringing the total to 27. And just a couple of years ago, Croatia joined in 2013. Right now, there are 5 more candidate countries waiting in the wings, including Turkey. Revelation 17, once again, Verse 12, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings. 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, one mindset, one agenda. They shall give their power and strength unto this beast. Time setting, once again, they will make war with Jesus Christ at his coming, and the Lamb shall overcome them. Let's go one more verse to 15. And he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the horse sits are, let the Bible interpret itself, peoples, multitudes, and nations, and tongues. The European Union has brought together 28 nations from the Atlantic to the Black Sea with 24 official different languages. More information about the European Union. It holds regular summit meetings with partners such as the United States, Japan, Canada, Russia, Ukraine, India, and China. It also holds what they call regional dialogues, sitting down at tables and just talking with other countries in Asia, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Latin America. These relationships, focused initially on trade issues, have expanded over the years to cover investment, economic cooperation, finance, energy, science and technology, environmental protection, as well as the global war on terror, international crime, drug trafficking, human rights. The list goes on and on and on of what they're talking about. Revelation 18, again, verse 3, for all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven, verse 4 says, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Down in verse 9, and the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And the merchants, verse 11, of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buys their merchandise anymore, the merchandise of gold and silver, and it goes on and lists all the way into verse 13 as the list continues, and notice that, and cinnamon and odors, ointments, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men, the lives of men. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 27. Other things that we've talked about were called what we've called types and any types that are described in your Bible. And we know that in learning the truth of God entails a process that lasts a lifetime. Here a little, there a little, line upon line, precept upon precept, year after year. As we read through the Bible, we reread the Bible. If the prince of Tyre is a type of Lucifer's description before he became Satan, the devil, what does this tell us about the city of Tyrus itself? Verse 1 in Ezekiel 27, the word of the Lord came again unto me, Ezekiel, saying, now, thou son of man, take up a lamentation for Tyrus, and say unto Tyrus, O thou that art situate at the entry of the sea, where he's situated, which art a merchant of the people from many isles or coastlands. Thus says the Lord God, O Tyrus, thou hast said, I am of perfect beauty. Thy borders are in the midst of the seas. Thy builders have perfected thy beauty. Then it goes on and describes all the riches that all the world has brought through the main shipping port of Tyrus back then. In verse 24, these were thy merchants in all sorts of things, and blue clothes, broidered work, a chest of rich apparel, bound with cords made of cedar among the merchandise. The ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market, and thou wast replenished and made very glorious in the midst of the seas. Study a map of the Mediterranean Sea, and you'll see where Tyrus sits. The verses go on to prophesy about the fate of Tyrus by God. And then in Ezekiel chapter 28, the word of the Lord came again to me, saying, Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is lifted up, and you have said, I am God, I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas, yet thou art a man and not God. Though thou set thine heart as the heart of God. Behold, this is interesting, thou art wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that can be hid from you. With your wisdom and with your understanding, you have gotten you riches, you have gotten gold, silver into your treasures, by your great wisdom and by thy traffic hast thou increased thy riches, and thy heart is lifted up because of thy riches. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, because you have set your heart as the heart of God, behold, therefore I will bring strangers upon you, the terrible of the nations, and they shall draw their swords against the beauty of thy wisdom, and they shall defile your brightness. They shall bring you down to the pit, and you shall die the deaths of them that are slain in the midst of the seas. And what's interesting is that this fulfilled prophecy concerning Tyre is also the future fate of the beast and the false prophet of Revelation. It's a dual prophecy. Today, the physical seaport of Tyre, located off the coast of Lebanon. If you look at the map, there's nothing more than a small island for local fishermen. God said that it would no longer exist, just as he said concerning the actual physical city of Babylon. But God uses symbolism throughout his prophecies as well as duality. Beyond Europe, the beast power, with the Vatican, the false prophet, we have a Gentile world system symbolized as Babylon. Question. Why do you think God did what he did in Genesis 11 in the city of Babel? You don't have to turn there, but he said in verse 6 of Genesis 11, the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. Speaking of the city and the Tower of Babel. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. We are on God's timeline, and back then, things could have gotten out of hand, but it wasn't time yet. We don't know exactly what could have transpired, but there was a reason why God confounded the language back then. Nothing will be restrained from them on what they imagined to do. Today, there are no language barriers in the world. Matter of fact, even the European Union are talking about using one common language in their countries. And of all languages, they say they're going to start using, we thought it was going to be French, because it was an important language in Brussels, which is the capital of France. But it says that for the first time since the Roman Empire, now has a language a large chunk of its people can converse with each other in. English is what they're going to change it to. It's something to be celebrated, it says in this article. It says it makes travel smoother, communication quicker, and doing business easier. Most of all, it allows Europeans to connect with each other. That was interesting when I read that. There's a lot more going on in Europe which are triggering things. And if you think about the triggers, what do you think would trigger certain specific prophecies that we've always talked about as we reflect on what's triggered recent events? Things that we don't want to think about. Like, for example, this week when they had the rape and the things going on with the refugees and the migrants over there. They have a problem. They have a people problem. And today we know that the events in the Middle East are no longer a regional problem. The heads of these nations can't just sit down and work it out and we can sit at our supper tables and think, okay, these governments have it all under control. The economic crisis of the world trickled down into our own family homes. Turn to Daniel chapter 11. Here's a couple of facts while you're turning there about the beast power. The European Union is the world's largest internal trading market. The member states account for almost a third of the entire global economy. The euro is already the second most commonly traded reserve currency and is a strong candidate to displace the dollar as a predominant reserve currency. The European Union is the largest trading, economic, scientific, and research partner of Israel, and it is the biggest donor of aid to the Palestinians. The European Union imports more agricultural goods from developing countries than do the United States, Canada, and Japan combined. The EU and its member states provide 54% of global development assistance and is the world's largest contributor to aid to Africa. Transatlantic internet bandwidth between the EU and the U.S. is 3 times that between the U.S. and the Asian Pacific region, 7 times more than between the U.S. and Latin America. European Union members provide 80%, which is going to increase, of NATO's international security force. That's just in Afghanistan. European troops from the backbone of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Lebanon. They are the backbone. 60,000 European peacekeepers are currently serving around this world's globe, Asia, Africa, as well as the Middle East. The prophet Daniel lived to see the Babylonian Empire fall at the hands of the Medes and Persians in 539 BC. And once again, he found favor with the new world rulers and continued to hold positions of influence. But the coming of the Messiah and the restoration of his people continued to preoccupy his mind. He never ceased to ask God for understanding. Once again, Daniel received his answers by God's revealing one of the longest prophecies in the Bible in terms of a continuing series of events that were predicted. And without going into detail, chapters 11 and 12 of Daniel show a remarkable foretelling of the expanding and fading of great empires. It also shows an ongoing struggle for power between kings, has political intrigues, invasions and counter-invasions, and they're all mixed with times of great persecutions for those who remain faithful to God. And at the end, the details of this prophecy become specific to the amount of days. Once again, Daniel's mind wonders when these things. But God knew that that was enough and tells him that those words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Daniel never did get that big question answered, but those prophecies that are written in your Bible are very, very important to our perspectives and understandings of what's going on in the world today. Prophetic events are not to be thought of only in the context of the ancient times and those ancient peoples. Prophetic events will not affect only the people of ancient Judah and ancient Israel. But in parallel with ancient Israel and Judah, their descendants who are living in the latter days will be making the same kinds of mistakes as their forefathers did. We have an ideological problem with the migration of Arab peoples to a very different type of free world countries. If y'all remember 9/11, we lost freedoms as they pulled security around the globe. The heads of nations with their quote-unquote think tanks, they're going to have to sit down once again. Is it possible that the city seaport of Rome, Italy, could be chosen as a common Arab international port? They have to do something. How soon, another question, will we see the king of the north and the king of the south? Daniel 11, verse 23. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, the spoil, the riches. Yeah, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. The words used here. We had a device called the atomic bomb that ended World War II. Just thinking about devices. Verse 26 says, "Yeah, and they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him. And his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. But it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be for a time appointed. It is not time yet. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. And at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south. But it shall not be as a former or as a latter, for the ships of Shittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate." Words that Jesus Christ said when he said, referred to his prophet Daniel. Reread the history of ancient Greece in your not so spare time, but make a point to reread it. Reread it and learn of Alexander the Great and the prophecies of Daniel. This is also a dual prophecy, because when Jesus Christ quoted these words, it was after that time period. Verse 36 says, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him with like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, many, many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians, that's in Africa, shall be at his steps. From Rome, Italy, to the south, across the Mediterranean Sea, lies northern Africa and Libya. I'm not going to read all these articles because of time, but the European Union has a problem. And they're to invest $1 billion in regions along of its external borders. They have a migrant problem and people problem. Along with that, France, according to this headline, proposes a Eurozone government. French leader Francis Hollande says that the Eurozone should have its own quote-unquote government and specific budget with democratic control by the European Parliament. He added that France is ready to form a vanguard with other Euro states which decide to press ahead with the project. You think of the 28 and more counting countries of the European Union. And I wondered, out of those 28, who would form that 10-nation combine? And then I put two and two together, and I'm like, okay, they will receive power as kings. I thought about what a king has besides territory and subjects and laws, and one of the things that a king does have is money. And with that money, I thought about the Eurozone. There are 19 countries that form the euro in the Eurozone. And now they're talking about a vanguard of countries within that Eurozone. And according to their treaty, their latest treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, they have a stipulation in there which they've brought out in detail called enhanced cooperation, which that law tells them that if at least 9 member states get together and decide that they want to do a specific thing within their countries, that they can go ahead with it. They're already making headlines and talking about a 2-speed Europe. Germany wants a European army. He said that the Middle East would not become stable without a stronger European engagement. France calls for vanguard of states to lead and strengthen the strengthened Eurozone. The headlines are all over. This is pretty interesting, too. The headline is Making the EU Fit for the 21st Century Challenges. And this is the Merkel factor, they're calling it. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel, also, she is the Person of the Year on Time magazine, has become Europe's crisis manager in chief. Berlin has become the center of the EU, not Brussels, as generations of EU architects had planned. Later, this is interesting, what emerges from recent years is that the EU is becoming a different beast than its founders had in mind. That struck me. And it goes on to talk about what they were planning on doing. While the EU is being challenged on many counts, we have also seen that it's much stronger and robust than many would have thought. EU institutions have evolved into an organism which permeates policymaking and administration in almost all fields at almost all levels. This underbelly of Europe, led and administered by an army of public servants in Brussels and capitals, a cosmopolitan elite educated in the spirit of cooperation, is barely visible, and yet it plays a crucial role by keeping the EU together in a myriad of daily interactions. This wide and deep Europe is not in crisis, as many would see. Due to the world's economic situation, and I don't have time to read a lot of these, the instability in the Middle East that we see going on, due to the diversity of cultures in Europe, and mainly because prophecy will and must be fulfilled. A 10-nation combine will rise in Europe. These will be the 10 toes of Daniel chapter 2. These will be the 10 horns of Daniel chapter 7. These will be the 10 kings of Revelation. They will be called the core Europe. They will form by using the laws within their treaties. One of the laws, like I mentioned before, is called enhanced cooperation in the Lisbon Treaty. Among them, a different kind of king will rise up. He is the head of the city-state called the Vatican. Altogether, they will prosper beyond imagination. Perhaps some in the world will benefit from them during that great tribulation of 3.5 years. Their power is written in their laws. These 10 kings will receive power from the EU. The Vatican will receive power from the 10 kings and the EU, as well as from the EU's military. Why will he need military? Probably because he will influence the king of the north, quote unquote, and push at the king of the south. Remember, besides food and economics and territory, religion has a lot to do with wars and all these rumors we hear of wars. Perhaps the Arab League of Nations, the Palestinians, and Israel will sit at a future council meeting. We know they must, with what's going on with the migrants in Syria and the Middle East. Perhaps then they will mistakenly agree for the Pope to set up residence at the Holy Land in Jerusalem. Perhaps it's speculation only. I emphasize speculation. With the Mediterranean Union agreement that they're talking about, that includes the Arab League and Israel, Jerusalem will already be surrounded, and the world will say, peace at last. But we know better, and God knows better. Why all this will happen is written in your Bible. How all this will happen is written in the documents and treaties of the beast power. When all this will happen, only God the Father knows that answer. So keep watching Europe, keep watching world events, and pray always.